Hey there and welcome back to another Disney video. And recently, we saw the long-awaited sequel to the 2007 hit film Enchanted with the release of Disenchanted a few days ago. And that's after a 15-year gap between installments. And now I'll be honest, until this film actually came out, I'd never seen the first film. I had heard of it, but I'd never actually bothered to sit down to watch it. And since I figured it would probably be the smart play to actually watch the first film before trying to understand the sequel, here we are. And so, luckily, I wasn't going into the sequel being blinded by nostalgia or anything like that. In fact, I was just kind of expecting both of them to be straight up bad. But the fact of the matter is that the first film was actually pretty damn decent. I really didn't expect it to be, and so it hit me like a train. It was such a clever mix between honouring the legacy of all those Disney classics whilst also tearing them to shreds and showing how stupid they are in a modern context. Or literally any other context. Hell, even in the context of the fairy tale worlds. In Enchanted, it seems quite silly. And it works because it's funny and it's wholesome. And while at times it is a little bit cringy, at the same time I think that element of cringe factor does add to its charm. And the world at large agreed. 2007. It was a different time. But yeah, anyway, it did well for itself. It got 3 Oscar nominations for Best Original Song and still managed to lose. And by God, that has to hurt. It grossed $340 million off a budget of $85 million, which is very decent. It has a 93% on Rotten Tomatoes from a critical perspective, and an 80% from an audience perspective, which, you know, that's a really good score. So all in all, the film was an absolute triumph. So there I am, after having watched this film in preparation for the first one, and now having a lot of hype. I'm not fueled by nostalgia or anything like that, and nor was I going to go into it with unfair comparisons being drawn. My only real fears were this. 1, it's a different screenwriter, I did check beforehand, and 2, it was a different director. Oh, and 3, it's been like 15 years. So what are the chances it's going to have that same vibe with all that time passed and with a different creative team? So it did have me worried from the get-go. And honestly, I think I was quite right to be worried because whilst I was hyped, this film actually did let me down. I'll go more in depth as we go along, but I'd say the key descriptors you could give to a film like this would be, is boring, cringy, and tone deaf. And I think this is reflected in the reception it's gotten. The reviews are far more mixed than they were for the initial film. On Rotten Tomatoes, the critical score is really bad, 43% as of writing this review, which is, yeah, it's a 50% drop off in approval rating from the first one. And that's a very bad sign. The audience score is a little better, but it still had a 20% drop down to 60% approval. And that's without there being that many reviews yet, so it does need some time to settle. After all, the first one had over 250,000 audience reviews, whereas this one has like 100 plus or so. So there's certainly time for it to go further in either direction. Although personally, I think the reviews will probably drag down the score in the end. The overall consensus seemingly being that this film just didn't live up to the first one in any major way. Although apparently there's been some praise for Amy Adams' performance. Although, in my eyes, she did completely pale in comparison to her performance 15 years ago, but yeah, whatever. So we'll start off with the plot. I watched this film so that you didn't have to, so I'd better tell you what the hell happens. 10 years after the events of the first film, the Phillip family are still living together in Manhattan, now with a new little baby. A baby named Sophia. However, over the years, the adults have started to grow disillusioned with city life and long to make a new home out in the suburbs. And of course, they do this, moving to the suburban Monroeville. And yeah, as is typical for this sort of story, their new town sucks. Nobody likes them, Robert has a long commute back to work, and Morgan, their eldest daughter, age 16, doesn't really appreciate her entire life being uprooted. And you know what? Fair enough. The poor kid was 16. They couldn't have waited, 2 more years to do this? Let her start college or whatever? It's not like the baby's starting school anytime soon anyway. But yeah, anyway, back to the story. Their fairy tale friends, Edward and Nancy, pay them a visit and give them a wishing wand for Sophia to use when she gets older. Of course, to try and make everybody happy in this new town, Giselle decides to use the wand to make their life a perfect fairy tale, transforming the town overnight into a fairy tale kingdom, and slowly turning her into an evil stepmother, throwing her relationship with Morgan into chaos, whilst also pitting her against the new evil queen, Malvina Monroe, who's been given the powers of the evil queen from Snow White, I guess. They clash. Morgan helps turn Giselle good again, and then Giselle embraces her as her true daughter and lets her use the magic wand to reverse the spell, and yada yada yada. Everything goes back to how it was before. Hooray! And I'll be honest, the story itself, sometimes these ideas, they sound good, but then the execution's flawed. But here, this script, this story, I just don't get the idea. The entire charm of the first film was that it was a homage and a parody. It was cheesy and silly, but that cheesiness and that stupidity was acknowledged in story. like when Giselle would start randomly singing. Morgan and Robert would be justifiably confused. When she charms all her animal friends, they're all gross, diseased pests like rats and pigeons and cockroaches. People find her and the prince very strange because, yeah, they are strange. That's the whole joke. That in real life, all these fairy tale tropes are ridiculous and play out like a silly melodrama. In the big ballroom climactic scene during Enchanted, they have a big confrontation with the evil stepmother queen. And as that's going on, the people watching them start clapping and cheering, thinking they're watching that year's gala entertainment. Robert continually denies the existence of magic and the fact that Giselle's from a magical kingdom until the evidence is slapping him in the face. Giselle has all these elaborate and beautiful costumes that she's made from the fabric in Robert's house, destroying his blinds and rugs. And here, they kind of do that for like the first 20 minutes or so, where Morgan understandably finds it cringe when Giselle randomly breaks out into song in front of everybody and just wants to go and hide. But then after that, it almost felt like the story forgot it was a parody. And it felt like they started playing up all this stuff way more seriously. Like, they wanted to make a straight up musical fairy tale movie instead of a movie that's completely tongue-in-cheek about all the tropes and whatnot. And so instead of an Enchanted sequel, it just felt like Descendants 4. And I don't know what you think about those films, but believe you me, that isn't a compliment. Beyond that, everything else just felt like a pale shadow of the original. At its core, the first film was a love story. The tale of a young woman falling in love with a single dad and coming to love his daughter like her own. But this wasn't really followed up on in the narrative. In the original, the villain was almost a side story. Here, it felt like the clash between the evil stepmother Giselle and the evil queen took precedence over all. Robert was hardly involved in any of the story, and he had his own weird midlife crisis side story where he hunts monsters. And yes, Morgan and Giselle's bond was the starting point, but it was mostly tossed aside in favour of Giselle being wicked. Furthermore, they also lost the charm of it being a fairy tale in New York City, the old and the new clashing together. Here, it's taken to the suburbs, likely because filming in New York City was a nightmare for the first film, and that's fine, but then they got rid of the modern elements by using a spell to make everything fairy tale. All the costumes, the sets, the decor. And that was just lame. And it very much spoiled the effect. On top of that, the songs were so much less iconic and memorable, and let's face it, the acting was worse. There is far more legitimate cringe in this film than in the first one. I mean, Giselle was still good, but, nowhere near as good as the first film. And the writing for her character, and honestly, all the characters, was atrocious. Terrible writing mixed with weak performances all round, although I did like the king/prince, but even then, he's in like 2 scenes, so you can't do much with that. So yeah, in summary, this film ain't it. It just ain't it. I don't like it. And I think it's a classic example of why some franchises just need to stay in the past and continue to be a nostalgic, happy memory. It doesn't ruin the first film, but it annoys me that it exists. And so, with all that being said, that's the end of the video, and I would like to remind you that these were just my opinions, and now I'd like to hear yours. What did you think of the film if you've seen it? Did it live up to the original? Did you think it was even good at all? I'm curious for your thoughts, so make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and let me know.